If I cannot have you, then no one will." Those were the last words Frederick Blackwood said before he lunged at the pregnant woman standing alone in that mine, a woman he had bought for $43, a woman who had a single-shot Derringer hidden in her boot, and exactly 4 feet between her and the man who had already buried 2 wives. But this story does not start in a mine. It starts on a frozen mountain road with a dying stranger and the man who should have kept riding. The gunshot split the night like a crack of thunder. Garrett Holden stood on the porch of his cabin, blood running warm down his left arm, his right hand steady on the Winchester rifle. The blizzard howled around him like a chorus of wolves, snow driving sideways through the darkness, turning the world into a white and screaming void. He could see them retreating, 4 shapes dissolving into the storm, dragging a 5th between them. Their bullets had found flesh, but he knew they would be back. Men like these always came back. Behind him, inside the cabin, where firelight flickered against log walls, a woman stood trembling but upright. Her hands still gripped a pistol. Her name was Clara. Clara Bennett, though he supposed she was Clara Holden now, at least in the eyes of God and the territory of Colorado. She stepped onto the porch beside him. Her breath fogged in the frozen air. Snow caught in her wheat-colored hair. Her blue eyes, the color of summer storms, held no fear, only resolve. "They will come back," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "I know." Garrett did not turn to look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness where the men had vanished. "And next time he will not come alone." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her despite the cold. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Saving me that day." Garrett finally turned. His ice-blue eyes met hers in the flickering light that spilled from the open door. He looked at this woman who had crashed into his life like a comet, who had awakened something in him he thought died 7 years ago in a frozen grave beside his wife and daughter. "No," he said. "Not for 1 second." The wind screamed. Snow swirled between them, and somewhere in the darkness, enemies gathered their strength for another assault. This is how it all began. The morning Garrett Holden found her started like any other September morning in the high country of Colorado. Gray light filtered through cabin windows. Frost painted the glass in crystalline patterns. The world outside lay silent under the first dusting of winter snow. Garrett rose before dawn as he had every day for the past 10 years. He was 37 years old. His hands were calloused from a decade of ranching work. His face was weathered from sun and wind, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. People said he kept his expression blank because life had already taken enough from him. They were not wrong. He dressed in the darkness, pulling on wool and leather, the familiar ritual of a man who had learned to need no one. The cabin was cold. He lit the fire in the main room, fed kindling to hungry flames, watched them grow into something that could push back the chill. Through the window he could see the ranch spreading out before him. Thunder Ridge, they called it. 2,000 acres of mountain meadow and pine forest. Good grazing land for the cattle. Shelter for the horses when winter came hard. He had built this place with his own hands. His brother Wyatt beside him. Their friend Sawyer helping where he could. 3 men alone on a mountain. That was how it had been for 7 years. That was how Garrett thought it would always be. He made coffee. Strong and black the way he had drunk it since he was 16 years old and working cattle drives across Texas. The bitter taste was familiar, comforting in its constancy. Everything else in life could change. Coffee stayed the same. Wyatt emerged from his room around sunrise. Younger than Garrett by 3 years, his dark hair still mussed from sleep. He had the same build as his older brother, tall and broad-shouldered, but his face was clean-shaven and his hazel eyes held something softer, something that had not quite been beaten out of him by the world. Wyatt was an artist. Garrett had never fully understood it, but he had learned to accept it. In the corner of the main room stood an easel stacks of canvas jars of paint in colors that had no names Garrett knew. His brother could look at a mountain and see things Garrett could not see, beauty maybe, or sadness, or both. "Storm coming," Wyatt said, pouring himself coffee. "Big one from the looks of it." Garrett nodded. He had felt it too, the pressure change in the air, the way the animals had grown restless, the clouds piling against the western peaks like an invading army. "I need to ride to Silver Creek," Garrett said. "Pick up the supplies Reynolds ordered." Wyatt glanced at the window at the sky that was already darkening, though the sun had barely risen. "You sure about that?" "I will make it." Famous last words. Garrett almost smiled. Almost. Smiling was not something he did often anymore, not since Sarah. Sawyer appeared then, the third member of their unlikely family, 32 years old, blond where the Holden brothers were dark, his features refined in a way that spoke of Eastern education and old money. Sawyer Crane had come from Boston from a family that had more wealth than warmth. He had walked away from all of it at 20 years old, wandered west until he found Garrett and Wyatt, and never looked back. The three of them had built something together, not just a ranch, but a life, a brotherhood forged from choice rather than blood. They shared everything: work, decisions, the silence that came from men who had learned that words were often unnecessary. "Safe ride," Sawyer said, and there was genuine concern beneath his casual tone. "Do not do anything heroic." Garrett pulled on his coat, checked his rifle, stepped out into the cold. The sky pressed down heavy and gray. The air tasted of coming snow. He did not know as he swung onto his black stallion Diablo and headed down the mountain trail that this day would change everything, that he would return with something more than supplies, that by nightfall a stranger would be sleeping in his spare room and the carefully constructed walls around his heart would have begun to crack. The ride to Silver Creek took 3 hours on a good day. Today was not a good day. Garrett pushed Diablo hard, watching the sky grow darker with each mile. The clouds were moving fast, rolling down from the high peaks like something alive and hungry. He had lived in these mountains long enough to know what that meant. This would not be a gentle snow. This would be the kind of storm that killed cattle and buried travelers, and did not care about human plans. He loaded the wagon at the general store quickly, not stopping to talk with the locals who watched him with the wary curiosity they always showed. Garrett Holden was known in these parts, known for keeping to himself, known for the ranch he had built from nothing, known though no one dared mention it to his face for the tragedy that had brought him here in the first place. The storekeeper, old Reynolds, helped him secure the last of the grain sacks. "Storm is coming fast," Reynolds said. "You might want to wait it out in town." "Cannot afford to. The cattle need feeding." Reynolds shook his head but said nothing more. He had known Garrett long enough to understand that arguing was pointless. The man made his decisions and stuck to them. Consequences be damned. The storm hit in earnest halfway up the mountain. One moment the snow was a gentle curtain. The next, it was a white wall that swallowed the world. Wind screamed down the canyon, driving ice crystals into Garrett's face like tiny knives. Diablo snorted and stamped, fighting against the gale, but the horse trusted his rider and kept moving. Garrett knew this road, knew every twist and turn, every dangerous drop-off, every place where the trail narrowed to barely wide enough for a wagon. He had ridden it 100 times in every kind of weather, but even he felt the cold fingers of doubt creeping in as visibility dropped to nearly nothing. Then he saw something that made no sense, a shape on the road ahead, moving, stumbling, too small to be an animal, too upright to be anything but human. Garrett squinted through the driving snow, his hand automatically moving to the rifle at his side. Bandits sometimes use decoys, a wounded traveler to draw in good Samaritans before their partners emerged from hiding. He had not survived this long by being careless. But as he drew closer, he saw that this was no ambush. It was a woman. She was staggering along the trail like a ghost barely visible through the white curtain of the storm. Her dress was gray-torn at the shoulder, dark with something that might have been mud or might have been blood. Her hair, blonde, like ripe wheat, hung loose and tangled, matted to her head by rain and ice. She was dragging a small trunk behind her as if the contents were too precious to abandon even in this hell. That trunk. Something about the way she clutched it, the way her fingers would not release the handle even as her legs gave way beneath her, Whatever was inside mattered more to her than her own survival. She fell as he watched. Not a graceful fall, not a swoon. She went down hard face first into the snow and did not get up. Garrett was off his horse before he knew he had decided to move. He knelt beside her, turned her over, and felt his breath catch in his throat. She was young, mid-20s perhaps. Her face was pale as death, her lips tinged blue from cold. A gash ran across her forehead, still bleeding sluggishly, painting a crimson streak down her temple. But something about the wound caught his attention. The angle was wrong for a fall, the edges too clean. This looked less like an accident and more like something delivered by a human hand. Her eyes were open, blue as a summer storm, but they stared at nothing. No, not nothing. They focused on him, found him in the swirling white chaos. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Don't take me back. Please don't. Not save me. Not help me. Don't take me back." She feared whatever was behind her more than the death that waited in the snow. "I am not taking you anywhere," Garrett said, his voice rough, "except somewhere warm and dry." He gathered her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, far too light for a grown woman, as if she had been hollowed out by whatever had brought her to this mountain road. She trembled against his chest, but she did not fight him. "Stagecoach," she managed. "Stagecoach crashed. Driver is dead." Garrett understood. The road below was treacherous in bad weather. Several coaches had gone over the edge in years past. If she had survived a crash like that, she was either very lucky or very stubborn. He suspected both. "Anyone else?" "Just me." He lifted her onto Diablo, mounting behind her, one arm wrapped around her waist like an iron band. He left the wagon where it stood. The supplies did not matter now. Nothing mattered except getting this woman to shelter before the cold finished what the crash had started. She leaned back against his chest as the horse began to move. He could feel her shivering, feel the flutter of her heartbeat through her soaked dress. She was alive, for now. "Stay with me," he said. "Don't fall asleep." "Trying." "What is your name?" A pause, a breath that fogged in the frozen air. "Clara. Clara Bennett." "Garrett Holden." "You are going to be fine, Clara Bennett." She laughed at that, a broken sound that might have been despair or might have been hope. He could not tell which. "That is what they always say," she whispered, "right before everything falls apart." Then she went limp in his arms, and Garrett was left to guide his horse through the screaming storm, carrying a stranger whose name he barely knew, holding a trunk whose contents he could not guess toward a future neither of them could have imagined. The cabin materialized out of the storm like a ship emerging from fog. 2 stories of solid log construction built to withstand anything the mountains could throw at it. Light glowed in the windows. Smoke rose from the massive stone chimney. It was, Garrett thought, not for the first time, the only real home he had ever known. Wyatt met him at the door. His expression shifted from relief to alarm as he saw what his brother carried. "What the hell?" "Stagecoach accident. She is the only survivor." Sawyer appeared behind Wyatt. His green eyes widened as he took in the scene. The woman hung limp in Garrett's arms, her head lolled against his shoulder, blood still seeping from the wound on her forehead. "She needs a doctor," Sawyer said. "No time. Storm has the road blocked for miles. We handle this ourselves." They had done it before. Set broken bones, stitched wounds, tended fevers. Life on the frontier did not wait for professional help. You learned to manage, or you died. Those were the only options. They laid her on the bed in the spare room, the one nearest the fireplace. Wyatt built up the flames until the room was almost uncomfortably warm. Sawyer brought water and clean cloths, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Always one step ahead, always the one who kept calm when chaos arrived. Years in Boston had taught him that panic solved nothing. And Garrett, his hands still trembling from cold and something else he did not want to name, began to work. He cleaned the gash on her forehead first. It was deep but clean. But as he worked, Wyatt moved closer and studied the wound with the quiet intensity he brought to everything. "That is not from a crash," Wyatt said. His voice was low enough that only Garrett could hear. What do you mean? The angle, the edges. Someone hit her, Garrett, before the stagecoach, maybe days before. Garrett said nothing, but he filed the information away. Another piece of a puzzle he did not yet understand. Her ribs were bruised, maybe cracked, but nothing felt broken under his careful examination. Hypothermia was the real danger now. Her skin was ice cold, her pulse weak and thready. "We need to warm her," Garrett said. "Blankets, heated stones, whatever we have." They worked in silence. The three men who had lived together long enough to communicate without words. Wyatt wrapped heated rocks in cloth and placed them around her body. Sawyer piled blankets until she nearly disappeared beneath them. And Garrett sat beside the bed watching her face for any sign of consciousness. She woke as the fire crackled and popped, her eyes snapping open with sudden alertness. For a moment she looked wild, trapped, ready to fight. Her hand shot out, grasping for something that was not there, and Garrett realized she was reaching for the trunk he had set in the corner of the room. Then she saw him, and something in her expression shifted. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Thunder Ridge Ranch. You are safe." Thunder Ridge. She repeated the name, and Garrett saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition, then confusion, then what might have been hope. "I was looking for this place, the advertisement, for a governess position." The three men exchanged glances. A silent conversation passed between them, quick as lightning. "There was no advertisement," Wyatt said, his voice flat. Clara stared at him. "But I have the newspaper clipping. 3 young daughters need education. Isolated location. Good wages." "There are no children here," Garrett said quietly. "There never were." He watched the words hit her like physical blows, saw the understanding dawn in her storm-blue eyes, followed by a despair so profound it made his chest ache. Sawyer stepped forward, his voice gentler than the others. "We did not place that advertisement. Our former housekeeper did, before we fired her for stealing." "Martha Dawson," Wyatt continued. "She wanted revenge, placed advertisements for positions that do not exist, hoping to cause trouble for us." Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the despair had crystallized into something harder, something that looked almost like resolve. "So I came all this way for nothing." She spoke without inflection, as if reading words from a page. "The position does not exist. I have no job, no money to return east, no way to survive." Garrett studied her face. He saw the fine bones beneath pale skin, the intelligence in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw beneath the exhaustion and the fear a strength that reminded him of someone he had lost. "What are you running from?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Wyatt shot him a warning look, but Garrett ignored it. He needed to know. Clara met his gaze directly. No evasion, no false modesty. "A marriage," she said, "to a man who has had 2 wives before me. Both of them are dead." The silence that followed was heavy as snowfall. "Who is he?" Garrett asked. "Frederick Blackwood, Philadelphia." Sawyer drew in a sharp breath. "Blackwood, the banking family." Garrett had heard the name. Even out here 2,000 miles from Eastern society, word traveled. The Blackwoods were old money, connected to everyone who mattered, untouchable by scandal or law. But Clara had not told him everything. He could see it in the way her eyes kept drifting to the trunk in the corner, in the way her fingers twisted in the blanket. There was more, something she was holding back, something about that trunk. He did not press, not yet. She had given him enough to understand the shape of the danger. The details could wait. "You can stay," he heard himself say. Wyatt and Sawyer turned to stare at him. He had not discussed this with them, had not asked their permission. The words had come out before he could stop them, pulled from somewhere deep inside that he thought he had sealed shut 7 years ago. "We need someone to manage the household," Garrett continued. "The place has gone to hell since we fired Martha. Room and board in exchange for work. Stay through the winter. By spring you will have enough money to go wherever you want." Clara studied him with those storm-colored eyes, searching for the trap, waiting for the catch. "Why?" she asked. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Garrett did not answer immediately. He thought about Sarah, about the night he had first met her, a girl running from her family's plans, standing shivering outside a saloon in Texas. He had offered her shelter then too. She had given him a life in return. "Because I know what it is like to run," he finally said, "and I know what it is like to be saved." "I will stay," Clara Bennett said at last, "at least until spring." Garrett nodded. "Good. Now lie still while I finish cleaning that wound." Outside the cabin in the cold between the barn and the porch, Wyatt cornered his brother before Garrett could disappear into the routine of evening chores. "You did not ask us." Wyatt's voice was low, but it carried an edge Garrett had rarely heard from his younger brother. "A stranger. A woman running from God knows what. And you just decided she stays." It was the first time in 7 years that Wyatt had openly challenged Garrett's authority. The first time he had stood in his brother's path and refused to step aside. Sawyer appeared beside them, hands in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold. He looked between the two brothers with the expression of a man who had spent a decade learning when to speak and when to listen. This was a speaking moment. "We cannot throw a wounded woman into a blizzard," Sawyer said carefully. "That is not who we are. But Wyatt has a point. Big decisions should be made by all three of us. That is how this works." Garrett looked at his brother, looked at Sawyer. He felt something shift inside him. A crack in the rigid structure he had maintained for 7 years. The structure that said he was the eldest. He made the calls. He carried the weight. "You are right," Garrett said. The words tasted unfamiliar. "From now on, 3 voices, 3 votes." Wyatt held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, not quite satisfied but willing to accept the compromise. They did not know it then, but Clara Bennett had already begun to change them. Not just Garrett, all 3 of them. She had been in their home for less than a day, and already the careful architecture of their isolation was showing fractures. The storm that had trapped Clara at Thunder Ridge raged for 3 more days. When it finally spent itself, the world outside was transformed. Snow buried the fence posts. Drifts climbed halfway up the cabin walls. The passes were sealed. The mountain had become a fortress. And inside that fortress, Clara Bennett began to heal. By the 3rd day, she was sitting up in bed taking soup and bread. By the 5th, she was walking through the house slowly but steadily, examining her new surroundings with the sharp eyes of someone cataloging escape routes. By the 7th day, she was working. She attacked the disaster Martha Dawson had left behind with the focus of a general planning a campaign. She emptied every cabinet, every shelf, every drawer. She sorted and organized and discarded with ruthless efficiency. She scrubbed surfaces until they gleamed, learned to operate the massive iron stove without burning anything, and by the end of that first week was producing meals that were not just edible, but actually good. She was not like the Eastern women Garrett had encountered before. Those women had been delicate, fragile, terrified of dirt and hard work. Clara Bennett had the same pale skin and soft hands, but beneath that surface lay something entirely different. She worked as if her life depended on it, because perhaps it did. She asked questions when she did not know something, admitted ignorance without shame, accepted correction without sulking. She did not pretend to be more capable than she was, but she also did not underestimate herself, and she never complained, not once. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Garrett found Clara standing on the porch in the bitter cold, staring up at the star-filled sky. "You will freeze," he said from the doorway. Clara did not turn around. "In Philadelphia, we never saw stars like this. Too many lights." He stepped onto the porch, keeping a respectful distance between them. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he ignored it. "Do you miss home?" "No." Her answer came immediately, without hesitation. "I miss my parents. They died when I was 16. But Philadelphia was never home." "Then where is home for you?" Now she turned, and Garrett felt the weight of her gaze like a physical touch. Her eyes were silver in the starlight, deep as mountain lakes. I do not know yet, she said. Maybe I am still looking. They stood in silence for a moment. Two people with wounded pasts breathing clouds of frost into the frozen air. What happened to your wife? The question caught him off guard. No one asked him about Sarah anymore. The people who knew him had learned not to, and strangers did not know enough to ask. How did you know I was married? You have a way of looking at me, Clara said softly, like you are seeing someone else, someone you lost. Garrett was silent for a long moment. The wind whispered through the pines. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Her name was Sarah, he finally said. Our daughter was called Lily. What happened? Winter fever. 7 years ago. It took them both within a week. He spoke without emotion, the words worn smooth by years of repetition in his own mind. I was not here. I was hunting, 2 days' ride from home. When I returned, they were already cold. You blame yourself. It was not a question. I should have been here, should have protected them. That was my job and I failed. Clara reached out and touched his hand. The contact was brief, light, gone almost before he registered it, but it sent warmth spreading through him despite the cold. You could not have defeated a disease, Garrett. You are not God. You are just a man who did his best. That is not enough. It has to be, she said, because it is all any of us have. She looked up at the stars again, and Garrett saw tears glistening in her eyes, silver tracks on pale cheeks. The dead do not want us to stop living, she continued. They want us to carry them forward, into whatever comes next. Garrett stared at her. This woman he had known for barely 2 weeks, who saw through his walls as if they were made of glass. You do not know what you are talking about, he said, but there was no heat in the words. Maybe not. Clara turned to go inside, pausing at the door. But I know what it is like to lose everything, and I know the dead would want us to keep going, not for their sake, for ours. She disappeared into the warmth of the cabin, leaving Garrett alone with the stars and the cold and the first crack in the armor he had worn for 7 years. That night, for the first time since Sarah died, he slept without nightmares. And when he woke, the first thing he thought of was not his dead wife's face, but the living woman in the room down the hall, with her storm-blue eyes and her stubborn refusal to break. During those same weeks, Clara found herself drawn to each of the 3 men in different ways she had not expected, ways that confused her. With Wyatt, it was art. She discovered him sketching one afternoon in the corner of the main room, his hand moving across the paper with a sureness that contradicted his usual quiet uncertainty. She sat down beside him without asking permission. You draw beautifully, she said. Wyatt glanced up, startled, then returned to his work. Thank you. You could draw anything, sell your work in any city. Why stay here on the mountain where no one sees it? He was quiet for a long time. His pencil kept moving, lines and shadows taking shape beneath his fingers. Because this is the only place I have ever felt like enough, he said. Clara understood that answer in a way she wished she did not. She told him about her parents, how they had loved her before they died, how her Aunt Margaret had destroyed the one thing Clara had left of them, a big brown mutt named Captain who had followed her everywhere since she was small. Aunt Margaret had him put down the first week I moved in. She said he was dirty and common. Clara paused. I think that was when I knew, truly knew, that she would never love me, that I was just a burden she was waiting to be rid of. Wyatt stopped drawing. He looked at her with those hazel eyes that saw things other people missed. You are not a burden, he said quietly. Not here. With Sawyer, it was intellect. He discovered one evening that Clara could read Latin, that she understood philosophy, that she could argue about literature with a precision and passion that matched his own. They spent evenings by the fire debating poetry and history while Garrett watched from his chair with an expression that was not quite jealousy and not quite admiration. Sawyer taught her things during those conversations. Law, territorial statutes, the rights of married women in Colorado. A married woman cannot be forcibly removed from her husband's home. Sawyer explained one evening, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Not even by family. Territorial law is clear on that point." Clara filed this information away. Sawyer saw her do it. And something passed between them, an understanding. That knowledge in the right hands could be as powerful as any weapon. And with Garrett it was something deeper, something that had no name, something that lived in the silences between them, in the way his scarred hands were gentle when he changed the bandage on her forehead, in the way she noticed he never sat with his back to a door. A habit of someone who had been hurt by what he could not see coming. 3 men, 3 connections, and Clara at the center of them. Not as a prize to be won, but as a catalyst that was changing each of them in ways none of them fully understood. Then came the morning that shattered the peace. Garrett rode out at dawn to check the fence line along the northern ridge. The snow had settled into a hard crust overnight, making the going easier than it had been in weeks. He followed the tree-line rifle across his saddle eyes, scanning the landscape with the automatic vigilance of a man who had lived on the frontier long enough to know that danger rarely announced itself. He almost missed it. Footprints, at the edge of the forest, partially filled with blown snow, but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. One person, moving along the tree line, stopping at intervals, the prints of someone who had stood in one spot for a long time, watching. Garrett dismounted and knelt beside the tracks. The impressions were wrong for this country. The sole pattern too smooth, too uniform. City shoes. Expensive ones from the depth of the impression. No one in Silver Creek wore shoes like these. He followed the prints for 50 yards. They led along the ridge to a point that offered a clear view down to the cabin, to the windows, to the door, to the porch where Clara stood every evening watching the stars. Someone had been watching them. Garrett's blood ran cold despite the morning sun. He remounted and rode back hard, arriving at the cabin with the kind of controlled urgency that made Wyatt and Sawyer reach for their weapons before he said a word. "Someone has been watching us," Garrett said. "From the tree line, city shoes, not anyone from town." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "How long?" "Hard to say. The prints are partially filled. Could be yesterday. Could be 3 days ago." Sawyer's green eyes narrowed with the calculating focus that emerged whenever a situation required strategy rather than strength. Martha Dawson placed that advertisement for a reason. If she wanted revenge, sending a woman here was step 1. Telling someone where that woman ended up could be step 2. The 3 men stood in the morning light, the cold pressing against them, and felt the first tremor of the storm that was coming. Not a storm of snow and wind, a storm of money and power, and the kind of men who believed they could buy anything, including a woman's freedom. They did not tell Clara, not yet. Garrett told himself it was because she was still healing, because she did not need more fear added to the weight she already carried. But the truth was simpler. He was not ready to see the light leave her eyes, not when she had only just begun to find it. But the mountain was no longer safe, and somewhere to the east a letter was making its way toward Philadelphia, toward a woman named Margaret Hale who had sold her niece for gambling debts, toward a man named Frederick Blackwood who had buried 2 wives and was shopping for a third. The calm before the storm was ending. And Garrett Holden, who had spent 7 years building walls around his heart, was about to discover that some walls were not strong enough to keep out what was coming. Not the enemies on horseback, not the bullets in the dark, but the woman with wheat-colored hair and storm-blue eyes who had already found her way inside. Because that was the thing about Clara Bennett. She did not break down walls. She walked through them, quietly, gently, as if they had never been there at all. And by the time a man realized what had happened, it was already too late to rebuild. Garrett knew this. He had known it since the moment he lifted her from the frozen road, and it terrified him more than any enemy ever could. In a boarding house in Philadelphia, 3 weeks before the first bullet struck the walls of Thunder Ridge, a woman named Margaret Hale sat at her writing desk and read a letter that made her smile. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a spider feeling the first vibration on its web. The letter was from Martha Dawson, former housekeeper, Recently fired. Very recently paid. Dear Mrs. Hale, the young woman you described has arrived at Thunder Ridge Ranch near Silver Creek, Colorado Territory. She is living with 3 unmarried men, the Holden brothers and a man called Crane. She appears to be recovering from injuries sustained during travel. She has not attempted to leave. I will continue to monitor the situation as agreed. Yours, M. Dawson. Margaret folded the letter with the careful precision she brought to everything. She opened the second drawer of her desk, the one she kept locked, and placed it beside a stack of similar correspondence. Then she reached for fresh paper and began to write 2 letters of her own. The first was addressed to Clara. The second was addressed to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, Chicago office. She did not hesitate over the words. She did not pause to consider whether what she was doing was right or wrong. Margaret Hale had not survived 53 years in Philadelphia society by entertaining moral doubts. She had survived by understanding transactions. And Clara was a transaction, a debt owed to Frederick Blackwood, a debt that Margaret intended to repay. In his study on Rittenhouse Square, Frederick Blackwood received his own letter from Margaret that same evening. He read it standing by the window, whiskey in hand, the gaslight casting sharp shadows across his angular face. 43 years old, twice a widower. The first wife dead 6 months after the wedding. They said she fell down the stairs. The second wife lasted 3 years before the illness took her. At least that was what the doctors wrote on the certificate. The doctors Frederick had paid. He did not react to the news that Clara had been found. He did not rage or curse or throw his glass against the wall. He simply read the letter again, folded it, and placed it in his breast pocket. "Let Margaret handle it first," he said to the empty room. "If the Pinkertons fail, then I will go myself." His voice was calm, almost pleasant. That was what made Frederick Blackwood dangerous. Not his money, though he had plenty. Not his connections, though they reached into every corner of Eastern power. It was his patience. The cold reptilian patience of a man who believed that everything and everyone had a price and that the only variable was how long it took to find it. He sipped his whiskey and looked out at the city lights. Clara had taken something when she ran, something more important than her freedom, something that could destroy everything he had built. A leather-bound journal hidden in the walls of his own house. His second wife Eleanor's journal. The one that described in meticulous detail every bruise, every locked door, every whispered threat. The one that named dates and witnesses and contained enough evidence to put Frederick Blackwood in prison for the rest of his natural life. He needed that journal back. And he needed Clara silenced. Permanently, if necessary. Back at Thunder Ridge, Clara had no idea that the machinery of her destruction was already in motion. She knew only that the days were growing shorter, the snow deeper, and the cabin warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the fireplace. It was the middle of November when Garrett started teaching her to shoot. She was terrible at first. She closed her eyes when she pulled the trigger. She flinched at the recoil so badly that her first shot went 10 feet above the target and buried itself in a pine tree. She missed the flour sack hanging from a branch by margins that would have been comical if the stakes had not been so deadly serious. But she did not quit. She practiced every morning in the bitter cold, her fingers cracking and bleeding from gripping the rifle, her shoulder aching from the kick. Her pride bruised worse than her body. Garrett stood behind her patient as Stone correcting her stance, adjusting her grip, teaching her to breathe the way a marksman breathes. Slow in, hold, squeeze, never pull. By the end of the first week, she could hit the flour sack at 30 yards. By the end of the second, she was hitting it at 50 with something approaching consistency. "You are a natural," Garrett told her one afternoon, and he meant it. "No," Clara replied. She lowered the rifle and looked at him with those storm blue eyes that saw too much. "I am just someone with something to protect." He wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to know if she was talking about herself, about the trunk she still kept locked in her room, about the future she was building one careful day at a time. But he did not ask. Because asking would mean acknowledging that he cared about the answer, and caring was still the thing that frightened him most. The midnight birth of Starlight's foal changed something between all of them. The scream came without warning. Not a human scream. Something deeper, more primal. The sound of an animal in mortal agony. Garrett was out of bed and moving before he was fully awake, years of frontier reflexes taking over. He pulled on boots and grabbed his coat, not bothering with buttons, as he ran through the darkened cabin. Wyatt met him at the door. "Starlight, the foal is coming." They raced through the snow to the barn. Inside lantern light painted the scene in shades of gold and shadow. Starlight was thrashing in her stall eyes, rolling white with terror and pain. The pregnant mare had carried her foal for 11 months, and now 2 weeks before Garrett expected the baby was demanding to be born. Sawyer was already there, sleeves rolled up, his face grim in the flickering light. "Something is wrong," Sawyer said. "The foal is not positioned right." Garrett knelt beside the mare, his hands gentle despite their roughness. He felt along her swollen belly, and his heart sank. "Breech," he said. "The foal is coming backwards. We need to turn it, or we lose them both." That was when Clara appeared. She stood in the barn doorway wearing only her nightgown and a thin shawl, her bare feet on the frozen ground. Her wheat-colored hair hung loose around her shoulders, wild and tangled from sleep. She did not look like a society woman from Philadelphia. She looked like she belonged here, on this mountain, in this barn, in this moment. "What can I do?" she asked. No hesitation, no fear, just the same calm determination she brought to everything. Garrett should have sent her back to the cabin. This was no place for a woman who had never seen birth, never dealt with blood and pain and the raw reality of life on the edge of death. "Hold her head," he said instead. "Keep her calm. Talk to her. Sing if you have to. I need her still while I work." Clara moved without hesitation to Starlight's head, her small hands pressed against the mare's sweating neck. She began to whisper soft words that Garrett could not quite hear, and somehow the panicking animal began to settle. Something in Clara's voice reached through the mare's terror and found the place where trust lived. Wyatt held the lantern high, casting steady light. Sawyer prepared towels and warm water, and Garrett, his scarred hands slick, reached inside the laboring mare to find her baby. The foal was turned completely wrong. Legs tangled, head pressed back. Every contraction pushed it harder into the birth canal in a position that would kill both mother and child. Garrett worked by feel alone, his eyes closed, his entire being focused on the tiny life beneath his hands. Minutes stretched into eternity. His arms ached. Sweat ran down his face despite the cold. He could feel the foal weakening its struggles, growing fainter. "Come on," he muttered. "Turn for me. Come on." And then he felt it shift. The foal rotated under his hands, moving from impossible to merely difficult. He grabbed hold and pulled, timing his effort with Starlight's contractions. "Now," he said through gritted teeth. "Everyone push." Clara pressed against Starlight's neck. Sawyer pushed from outside. Wyatt braced against the stall wall, and Garrett pulled with everything he had. The foal came into the world in a rush. It tumbled onto the hay with a wet thump. It did not move. Garrett grabbed clean straw and began rubbing the foal vigorously, clearing its nose and mouth, trying to stimulate breathing. 1 second, 2, 3. "Come on," he whispered. "Breathe. Breathe for me." The foal coughed. Then it drew in a shuddering breath, released a tiny, indignant whinny, and began to flail its legs. Starlight nickered softly, maternal instinct overriding exhaustion. She turned her head to nuzzle her baby, and the barn filled with the quiet sounds of new life finding its first footing in the world. They had done it, saved them both. Garrett sat back on his heels, exhausted, covered in the evidence of birth. He looked up to share the victory with the others and found all 3 of them looking at Clara. She stood in the lantern light, her thin nightgown soaked through with sweat and effort. Her hair hung wild around her face. Her chest heaved with exertion. She looked like something from an old story, some frontier goddess of birth and survival and all the messy, bloody, beautiful reality between. Garrett could not look away. He had seen her as a refugee, a victim, a guest in his home. He had watched her become capable, competent, essential. He had felt the stirring of attraction that he had tried so hard to deny. But in this moment, her eyes bright with triumph, her hands still gentle on the mare's neck, she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. And from the expressions on Wyatt and Sawyer's faces, he was not the only one who thought so. "We should clean up," Sawyer said finally, his voice rougher than usual. He stripped off his coat and draped it around Clara's shoulders. The gesture was protective, brotherly. But Garrett felt something twist in his chest nonetheless. That night none of them slept. And something that had been building since the day Garrett carried Clara out of the storm finally broke through the surface. He was sitting by the fire when dawn crept through the windows. Clara appeared dressed now, composed and proper, but Garrett could not unsee what he had witnessed in the barn. "You did not sleep," she said. "Neither did you." She sat in the chair beside him, the one she had claimed as hers over the weeks. The fire crackled between them. "I did not expect to find this," Clara said quietly. "A home, people who care, a reason to stop running." She turned to face him, and her eyes held depths he had not measured before. "I did not expect to find you, Garrett Holden." He should have stopped it there, should have put distance between them. Instead, he spoke the truth that had been building in him for weeks. "I am not a good man. I have done things that would turn your stomach. I have killed people, Clara, in the war and after. I know. I cannot promise safety or happiness or a future without pain. The only thing I can promise is that I will try to protect you, that I will stand between you and anyone who wants to hurt you." "That is enough," she said. "That is more than I have ever had." He took her hand. Her fingers were small and pale against his scarred, calloused palm. He should have let go. Instead, he tightened his grip. "Whatever comes," he said, "we face it together." "Together," Clara agreed. The supply wagon arrived on a rare, clear day in late December. Old Man Roberts, who ran supplies up from Silver Creek, handed Garrett a stack of mail along with the ordered goods. "One for your lady," Roberts said, his weathered face showing nothing. "Come all the way from Philadelphia." Garrett felt ice form in his stomach even before he saw the handwriting. Precise, formal. The penmanship of someone who viewed letters as instruments of control rather than communication. He found Clara in the kitchen, kneading bread. Flour dusted her forearms. A strand of wheat-colored hair had escaped its pins. "This came for you," Garrett said. Clara looked up, saw the envelope, and went still. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale as the snow outside. She took the letter with trembling hands, broke the seal, read. Garrett watched her expression cycle through shock, fear, anger, and finally settle on something cold and hard. "What does it say?" She handed him the letter without a word. "Clara, I know where you are and what you are doing. Martha Dawson was kind enough to inform me of your disgraceful situation. I have hired Pinkerton detectives to ensure your safe return to Philadelphia. They will arrive within the week. Do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Aunt Margaret." Below the aunt's words in different ink, a different hand, was a postscript that made Garrett's blood heat. "I want the journal. Return it, and perhaps I will let you be. If not, I will burn whatever hole you are hiding into the ground. F.B." Garrett set down the letter. His hands were steady. Inside, a cold fury was building. "She knows," Clara said, her voice hollow. "Martha Dawson," Garrett said. "She sold your location. And the journal. He knows about the journal." Garrett looked at her. "What journal, Clara?" The silence that followed was the heaviest yet. Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them, the decision had been made. No more secrets, no more holding back. "When I agreed to marry Frederick, I was given access to his house for the dress fittings and the wedding preparations. His second wife, Eleanor, had been dead for 8 months, but her rooms had not been fully cleared. One evening I was alone in the parlor, and I noticed a section of wall panel that did not sit flush with the rest." She paused. drew a breath. Behind it was a journal, Eleanor's journal. She had hidden it in the walls of her own prison, and she had written down everything, every bruise, every locked door, every night he came to her room smelling of whiskey and rage. She wrote down dates, names of servants who witnessed, descriptions of injuries that did not match the stories Frederick told the doctors. Clara's voice was steady now, the voice of a woman who had made peace with the weapon she carried. That journal is enough to put Frederick Blackwood in prison for the rest of his life. It is enough to destroy his family's name. It is enough to bring justice for Eleanor and for his first wife, whose death I believe was no accident either. She looked at the trunk in the corner of the room, the trunk she had dragged through a blizzard, the trunk she had refused to abandon even when she was dying. That is what is in the trunk. That is why he will never stop looking for me, not because he wants me, because I have the one thing that can destroy him. Garrett understood then. Everything clicked into place. The ferocity of her flight, the terror in her eyes when he found her, the way she clung to that trunk as if it contained her soul. It did not contain her soul. It contained something more dangerous, the truth. "Pinkerton detectives," Garrett said. "You know what that means." "I know." He looked at Wyatt, who had appeared in the doorway during Clara's confession, looked at Sawyer, who stood behind him, green eyes sharp with calculation. "We have a week," Garrett said. "Maybe less." Wyatt moved to the gun cabinet without being asked, began checking ammunition. Sawyer spoke with the precision of a man whose mind was already 3 moves ahead. "We need allies in town, people who will watch the roads and send word if strangers come asking questions. And we need the law on our side. If Clara has evidence of murder, that changes the legal calculus entirely." "No one on this mountain touches her," Wyatt said quietly. He was loading a rifle as he spoke, his hazel eyes harder than Garrett had ever seen them. "No one." It was the first time Wyatt had used that tone. The first time he had claimed Clara not as Garrett's responsibility, but as theirs. All of theirs. Garrett looked at his brother and saw something he had missed for 7 years. Wyatt was not the soft one. He was not the weak one. He was the one who had been waiting for something worth fighting for. "Together," Garrett said. "Together." Wyatt and Sawyer answered, and somewhere on a train heading west, 4 men in dark coats checked their weapons and reviewed a photograph of a young woman with wheat-colored hair and storm-blue eyes. Their instructions were simple. Bring her back alive. Use whatever force was necessary to accomplish this. They did not know about the 3 men waiting on the mountain. They would learn. The Pinkertons came at midnight, not during the day when they might be seen approaching across the open snowfields. They came in darkness, 4 shadows moving through the storm, thinking the blizzard would cover their approach. They were wrong. Garrett had been keeping watch every night since the letter arrived. He sat on the porch in the freezing cold rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the darkness for any movement that did not belong. He heard the horses first, hooves muffled by snow, but still audible to ears trained by years of frontier living. "Wyatt, Sawyer." His voice cut through the night like a blade. "We have company." The cabin erupted into controlled chaos, lights doused, weapons grabbed, positions taken with the efficiency of men who had discussed this scenario 100 times. They had planned for this, drilled for this, and now the drill was real. Clara appeared at Garrett's side, a pistol in her hand, her face pale but her jaw set. "Get inside," Garrett said. "No." Her voice left no room for argument. She planted her feet on the porch boards and raised the pistol with both hands exactly the way Garrett had taught her. Feet shoulder width, arms extended, eyes open. "I told you before," she said. "I am done running." There was no time to argue. The shadows were closer now, close enough to see the glint of metal in moonlight that broke through gaps in the storm clouds. The first shot came from the attackers, shattering a window in an explosion of glass. Garrett returned fire immediately. The rifle kicked against his shoulder as he tracked movement in the darkness. What followed was 5 minutes of hell. Muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning. Bullets thudded into log walls, whistled through broken windows, sent splinters flying through the air. Garrett fired and reloaded, his movements mechanical, his mind cold and clear. He heard Wyatt's rifle bark from the side of the house, steady, precise. Every shot placed with the same care Wyatt brought to his brushstrokes. Garrett realized in that moment that his brother had been watching every shooting lesson he had given Clara, learning alongside her, becoming something more than the quiet artist everyone assumed he was. He heard Sawyer's shotgun boom from the root cellar they had converted into a fighting position. Close-range devastation. Anyone who got within 20 yards of that position was making the last mistake of their career, and he heard Clara's pistol crack. Once, twice, 3 times. Not wild shooting, not panic fire. Aimed shots spaced with the breathing rhythm he had taught her. Then one of the attackers screamed, a sound of pure agony that cut through the chaos. Clara had found flesh. The shadows began to retreat, dragging their wounded between them. In less than a minute they had vanished into the storm, leaving only blood on the snow to mark their passage. Silence descended. Garrett lowered his rifle, his ears ringing, his heart pounding. He turned to check the others. Wyatt stood at the corner of the house, a graze on his arm bleeding sluggishly, but his eyes were clear and his hands were steady. Garrett looked down at his own left arm. A bullet had torn through the flesh just below the shoulder. He had not felt it during the fight. He felt it now. Sawyer emerged from behind the water trough, his face cut by flying glass, but otherwise unharmed. And Clara, she stood exactly where she had been when the shooting started, pistol still raised, eyes still scanning the darkness for threats that were no longer there. "Is everyone all right?" Garrett asked. "Fine," Wyatt said. "Fine," Sawyer echoed. "I think I hit one of them," Clara said, and her voice shook only slightly. Garrett crossed to her in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight he could feel her heart beating against his chest. "Don't ever do that again," he said. "Do what?" "Stand in the middle of a gunfight." She pulled back far enough to look at his face. "You were standing in the middle of a gunfight. That is different." "How?" Garrett looked at her. Looked at Wyatt and Sawyer standing on either side of the porch. 3 men and a woman in the aftermath of violence, snow falling gently now that the storm had spent its fury blood on the boards and bullet holes in the walls. "Maybe it is not different," he said quietly. "Maybe we protect each other. Maybe that is how this works." Clara smiled. Despite the blood, despite the fear, despite the enemies still out there in the darkness. She smiled, and Garrett felt his heart crack open like frozen ground in the first thaw of spring. "That is exactly how this works," she said. They found the note at dawn, pinned to the barn door with a knife. "Mrs. Margaret Hale offers $1,000 for Clara Bennett returned unharmed to Philadelphia." $1,000. In a territory where a working man earned $30 a month. Enough money to tempt saints, let alone the desperate and the greedy. "She put a price on my head," Clara said. She read the words and something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not despair. Something harder. Something that looked like the woman Eleanor Blackwood might have become if she had survived long enough to fight back. $1,000, Garrett said. "That is what she thinks you are worth." "It is more than I expected, actually. The moment might have been funny if it had not been so dangerous, because $1,000 would buy a lot of betrayal in a small mountain town, and they all knew it." In the weeks that followed, the cabin settled into an uneasy peace, but beneath the surface tensions ran deep. Wyatt finished the painting. He had been working on it for weeks, not the quick sketches in his notebook. A full canvas, oil on stretched linen, Clara by firelight, her wheat-colored hair catching the warm glow, her storm-blue eyes soft with the expression she wore when she thought no one was watching. Her hands resting in her lap, fingers intertwined the calluses she had earned visible on her palms. It was the most beautiful thing Wyatt had ever created, and he hung it in the main room without asking anyone's permission. Garrett saw it when he came in from the cold. He stopped in the doorway, stared at the canvas, and felt something move through him that was not admiration. "Take it down," he said. Wyatt turned from where he was cleaning his brushes. "Why? That is her. She is not something to hang on a wall." "It is art, Garrett. It is what I do." It is more than art, and you know it." Garrett's voice dropped to the register that had stopped bar fights and silenced rooms. "You have been looking at her, studying her, seeing things you should not be seeing." Wyatt set down his brushes with careful deliberation. He turned to face his brother fully, and for the first time in their lives the younger Holden did not look away. "You are jealous," Wyatt said. "You think because you found her first she belongs to you, but she is not property Garrett. That is exactly what Blackwood thinks, that she is something to be owned." The words landed like a slap, because they were true. The silence between the brothers was dangerous, the kind of silence that preceded violence in men who did not know how to express what they felt with words. Garrett's hands curled into fists. Wyatt's jaw set. Sawyer stepped between them, physically, placing his body in the gap between two men who loved each other and were about to say things that could not be taken back. "Clara does not belong to either of you," Sawyer said. His voice carried the authority of a man who had left everything behind once and understood what it cost to hold on too tight. "She belongs to herself, and if we tear this family apart fighting over her, then Blackwood wins. He wins without firing another shot. Is that what you want?" Garrett unclenched his fists. Slowly. Wyatt exhaled. "She chooses," Sawyer said. "When she is ready, if she is ever ready, and whatever she decides we respect it, because that is what good men do." The painting stayed on the wall, but something between the brothers had cracked, and it would take weeks to heal. Clara settled it herself, not with drama, not with a grand declaration, but in the quiet way she did everything. She found Wyatt alone in the barn one afternoon sketching starlight and her growing foal. She sat beside him on a hay bale and watched his hands move across the paper. "The painting you made of me," she said. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." Wyatt's pencil paused. But Garrett." He nodded, not surprised, not angry, just sad in the way that artists are sad when they see beauty they cannot capture. "I knew," he said. "I think I knew the moment he carried you through that door, the way he looked at you, like someone waking up from a long sleep. I am sorry, Wyatt." "Do not be sorry for knowing your own heart. That is the bravest thing a person can do." He looked at her then with those hazel eyes that saw everything. "But I need you to know something. Whatever you are to Garrett, you are family to me. I will protect you the same way I protect him, not because he asks me to, because you are worth protecting." Clara reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. Not what I could give you, not what I represent, just me." Wyatt returned to his sketching, but something in his posture had straightened. Something in his eyes had cleared. He had offered his heart, and it had been gently declined, and instead of breaking him, the honesty had set him free. With Sawyer, the conversation was even simpler. He found Clara reading by the fire one evening and sat in the chair opposite. "I am not going to pretend I am not drawn to you," he said with his characteristic directness. "You are the most interesting person I have ever met, but I also see the way you look at Garrett and the way he looks at you. He needs you in a way I do not. He has been dying for 7 years. You are the only thing bringing him back." Before he stood to leave, Sawyer reached into his coat and placed something small and cold in her palm. A derringer. Single shot. Pearl handled. "Not accurate past 10 feet, he said. "But 10 feet is enough if you are close enough. Keep it in your boot. Do not tell Garrett. He will only worry." "And what about you?" Clara asked. "Do you not need someone?" Sawyer smiled, the smile of a man who had lost his father to despair and found a family in its place. "I already have someone. I have Garrett and Wyatt, and now I have you. That is enough. More than enough." On a January evening 3 weeks after the first attack, Garrett asked Clara to marry him. He did it badly, without flowers or poetry or any of the gestures that Eastern women expected. He found her by the fireplace after dinner, took her hands in his, and spoke the truth as plainly as he knew how. "We need to get married, legally, a proper ceremony witnessed and recorded." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Is that a proposal or a tactical briefing?" "Both. Once you are my wife, your aunt has no legal claim on you. The Pinkertons cannot forcibly remove a married woman from her husband's home. Colorado territorial law is clear." "Is that the only reason?" Garrett looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between her softness and his roughness, at the calluses she had earned working beside him, matching the ones he had carried for years. "No," he said, "it is not the only reason. Because losing you would hurt worse than anything they could do to me. Because you woke me up from a 7-year sleep. Because when I look at you, I see a future instead of just a past." He paused, drew a breath. "Because I love you, Clara Bennett, and I am done pretending I do not." She kissed him then, not gently, not carefully, the kiss of a woman who had survived a stagecoach crash and a blizzard and a gunfight and the slow, devastating process of learning to trust again. "Yes," she said against his mouth. "Yes, I will marry you, Garrett Holden." "There is something else," Clara said. She pulled back just enough to see his face. Her expression had shifted, the joy still there but layered now with something more complex, something that was equal parts hope and terror. "I am carrying your child." The words dropped into the silence between them like stones into still water. Garrett went very still. His hand still holding hers began to tremble. "A baby," he whispered. "Yes." She watched his face, watched the emotions cycle through it faster than she could name them. Shock, fear, wonder, joy, and then something she had never seen before, something that looked almost like peace. "A baby," he said again, and his voice cracked on the word. "Sarah wanted more children. We talked about it before she got sick. A brother or sister for Lily. Garrett, I understand if you are scared, after what happened before." He dropped to his knees before her, his hands cradling her belly with a reverence that made her eyes sting with tears. "I am terrified," he admitted, "more terrified than I have ever been in my life. But Clara, I am also happy. Do you understand? For the first time in 7 years, I am genuinely and completely happy." He looked up at her, and she saw that his eyes were wet. "This child is a gift, our child, a reason to fight, a reason to win, a future that is worth protecting." They held each other in the firelight, two people bound together by love and danger and the tiny life growing between them. "I will protect you both," Garrett said. "I swear it, whatever it takes." "I know you will." In the doorway, unseen by either of them, Wyatt and Sawyer exchanged glances. Then they turned without a word and walked toward the gun cabinet. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, all of them. Sawyer rode into Silver Creek 3 days later. He went not with weapons but with information, the most powerful weapon he knew. He found the town's saloon busy with the afternoon crowd, working men, ranchers, miners passing through on their way to the claims higher up. And behind the bar, Jed Holloway, owner and proprietor, polishing glasses with the studied casualness of a man who listened to everything and pretended to hear nothing. Sawyer ordered whiskey, drank it slowly, and watched. It took him less than an hour to confirm what he had suspected. Holloway was asking questions, casual questions, the kind that sounded like small talk unless you knew what to listen for. Thunder Ridge getting much mail these days, and that new girl still up at the Holden place, and heard there was some shooting up that way. Everything all right? Sawyer finished his drink, set the glass down, and played his hand. He did not confront Holloway privately. He waited until the saloon was full, until every ear in Silver Creek was within range. Then he stood and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I want everyone here to know something. The woman living at Thunder Ridge Ranch is Clara Holden. She is Garrett's wife. She is carrying his child. And there are men coming from back east who want to drag her away from her home and her husband by force." The room went quiet. every face turned toward him. These men were hired by a woman who sold her own niece to pay gambling debts, sold her to a man in Philadelphia whose 2 previous wives died under suspicious circumstances. Clara ran. She came west. She found a home with us, and now those people want her back. Sawyer paused. Let the words settle. 3 weeks ago, 4 armed men attacked our ranch at midnight. They shot at a pregnant woman. They left a note offering $1,000 for her return, $1,000 to anyone willing to rip a wife from her husband's arms. He turned to look directly at Holloway. The saloon keeper had gone pale. His hands had stopped polishing. Some of you may have been asked questions about us, about Clara, about our movements. I want you to think carefully about who was asking, and I want you to think about what kind of man pays for information that gets a pregnant woman shot at in the middle of the night. Holloway set down his glass. His eyes darted toward the door. Jed, Sawyer said, and his voice was quiet now, almost gentle, which somehow made it more devastating. Would you like to tell everyone here who has been paying you, or should I? The silence that followed was absolute. Holloway looked around the room, saw no allies, saw only the faces of frontier men and women who had their own wives and daughters and understood exactly what was at stake. I did not know, Holloway stammered. She said she was the girl's aunt, said she was worried, said she just wanted to know the girl was safe. And the $1,000? Holloway had no answer for that. Sheriff Walker stood up from his table in the corner. He was a big man, quiet, the kind of lawman who preferred peace but was perfectly capable of enforcing it with his fists when necessary. Jed, Walker said, I think it is time you found somewhere else to be. Holloway left Silver Creek that afternoon. He did not come back, and Sawyer rode home with something more valuable than supplies. He rode home with the loyalty of a town that had decided collectively and without fanfare that Clara Holden was one of their own, that whatever came from the east would have to go through Silver Creek first. But he also rode home with news that turned the victory sour. Blackwood is coming himself, Sawyer said. He stood in the cabin's main room, snow still melting on his shoulders, his face drawn with the weight of what he had learned. He left Philadelphia a week ago, according to the telegraph operator, and he is not coming alone. Word is he hired a dozen men in Denver, hard men, the kind who do not care about public opinion or the law or anything except the money they are being paid. The room fell silent. Garrett pushed himself upright from the chair where he had been resting. His wound from the first attack had healed, but his body still carried the memory of that bullet. He would carry it for the rest of his life. How long? He asked. A week, maybe less, depending on the weather. Clara stood by the window, her hand resting on her belly. Her belly had grown round now, the baby moving inside her with the insistent energy of new life demanding its place in the world. Then we have a week to prepare, she said, and her voice did not waver. Garrett looked at her, at this woman who had come into his life like a storm and refused to leave, who was carrying his child, who had fought beside him in the dark, who had earned the respect of every man and woman in Silver Creek through nothing more than the force of her character. We will be ready, he said, whatever it takes. They fortified the cabin. Wyatt nailed boards over the windows, leaving only narrow slits for firing. Sawyer reinforced the doors with iron bars salvaged from the barn. Garrett checked and rechecked every weapon in the house, cleaning rifles, loading ammunition, until his hands moved through the motions without thought. Clara refused to be left out. She practiced shooting every day despite the cold, despite her growing belly, until she could hit a target at 60 yards with consistent accuracy. She learned to reload faster, to clear jams, to fire from cover without exposing herself unnecessarily. You are getting good, Garrett told her one afternoon, watching her put 3 shots through the center of a flour sack. I have a good teacher. She lowered the rifle and turned to face him, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her wheat-colored hair escaping from its pins, her eyes bright with the fierce determination that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. "I will not let them take me," she said, "and I will not let them hurt you or this baby. Whatever happens, I fight." Garrett crossed to her, wrapped his arms around her as best he could with her belly between them. "These months with you have been the happiest of my life," he said. "Since Sarah. I thought I would never feel this way again. You proved me wrong." "You proved me wrong too," Clara said. "I thought I would never have a home, never have someone who loved me for who I am instead of what I could give them." They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other against all odds, holding on to each other against the storm that was coming. Because the storm was coming, they could feel it in the air, in the way the animals grew restless, in the way the clouds gathered against the western peaks. Frederick Blackwood was riding toward them with 12 men and the cold determination of a man who had never been told no. But on a mountain in Colorado, 4 people stood ready: a wounded rancher who had learned to love again, an artist who had found his courage, a strategist who had found his family, and a woman with wheat-colored hair and storm-blue eyes who had stopped running and started fighting. But preparation was one thing. What was coming was another. The quiet before the battle was the hardest part, not the fear, not the preparation. The waiting, the knowing that violence was coming, and being unable to do anything but sharpen your weapons and count the hours. Garrett spent the last evening before Blackwood's expected arrival sitting by the fire with Clara and his brothers, the 4 of them together, perhaps for the last time. He would not allow himself to think that way, but the thought crept in nonetheless, unwelcome and persistent. "I want you all to know something," Clara said. The firelight played across her features. Her hand rested on her belly where the baby kicked with increasing strength. "Before I came here I had nothing, no family, no home, no one who would notice if I disappeared. You gave me all of that. Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that these months have been worth everything." Wyatt looked up from his sketchbook where he had been drawing the scene before him, firelight on faces, the last peaceful moment. "You gave us something too. Before you came, this was 3 men hiding from life. Now it is a family." Sawyer nodded from his chair. His book lay closed in his lap unread. "If tomorrow goes badly, I want everyone to know I have no regrets. This is the life I chose, and I would choose it again." Garrett took Clara's hand, held it in the firelight. "No matter what tomorrow brings," he said, "we stand as one." "As one?" they answered, all of them, and the words settled over the cabin like a benediction. Outside, the wind picked up. The first flakes of what would become the worst blizzard of the season began to fall, and somewhere on the road from Denver, 12 men on horseback rode through the gathering dark, led by a man whose cold eyes reflected nothing but the firelight of his own ambition. Frederick Blackwood was coming, and Thunder Ridge was ready. Frederick Blackwood arrived on a clear morning in late February when the sky was blue as Clara's eyes and the snow sparkled like diamonds in the winter sun. The kind of morning that made a man believe the world was beautiful and that nothing could go wrong in it. The kind of morning that liars and killers loved best. Garrett saw them first. A column of riders cresting the ridge to the south, moving in formation, their breath and their horses' breath fogging in the cold air like smoke from a dozen small fires. He counted 12 men, armed, riding with the loose confidence of professionals who had done this kind of work before and expected to do it again, plus 2 figures who rode slightly apart from the rest. One was a woman. Even at a distance, Garrett recognized the type, the rigid posture of someone who had spent a lifetime holding herself above the world, the expensive clothing that announced wealth and status, and the absolute certainty that both made her right. Margaret Hale, Clara's aunt, the woman who had sold her own niece to a monster for the price of her gambling debts, and riding beside her on a magnificent black horse was a man Garrett had never seen but recognized instantly. The way you recognize a rattlesnake before your mind registers what your eyes are seeing. Something in the way he sat the horse, something in the stillness of his posture, something that said this was not a man accustomed to being denied. Frederick Blackwood was 43 years old, but he looked older. His face was sharp and angular, the face of a bird of prey. His dark hair was slicked back from a high forehead. His clothes were expensive, immaculately tailored, absurdly out of place in the Colorado wilderness. A man dressed for a Philadelphia drawing room sitting on horseback in the snow. But it was his eyes that held Garrett's attention. Cold, empty, the eyes of a man who viewed other people as objects to be acquired and discarded. The eyes of a man who had buried 2 wives and slept soundly after each funeral. "They are here," Garrett called back to the cabin. "Clara, stay inside. Wyatt Sawyer positions." Clara appeared at the door, rifle in hand, her belly round beneath her coat, her wheat-colored hair catching the morning light. "I told you," she said. "I am not hiding." There was no time to argue. Blackwood had stopped his column 50 yards from the cabin, just outside effective rifle range. The man knew what he was doing. "Mr. Holden," Blackwood's voice carried across the snow, cultured, confident, the voice of a man addressing a servant. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Garrett stepped off the porch, his own rifle held loose but ready at his side. His wound throbbed with every step, but he kept his face blank, showing nothing, giving nothing. "I do not have anything of yours," Garrett called back. "Clara is a free woman. She made her choice." "Miss Bennett," Blackwood said the name like it tasted of something foul, "was promised to me. Her aunt and I had an arrangement, a legal binding arrangement." "Arrangements can be broken, and her name is Holden now." Blackwood smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Garrett had ever seen on a human face. No warmth in it, no humanity, just the cold calculation of a man who always got what he wanted and could not comprehend a world in which he did not. "I have come a long way, Mr. Holden. I have spent a great deal of money. I do not intend to leave empty-handed." "Then you will be disappointed." The smile widened. "I have 12 men behind me, well armed, well paid, with no particular attachment to moral considerations. You have what 3-4, if we count the pregnant woman." He shook his head with theatrical sadness. "The mathematics do not favor you." "Maybe not," Garrett said. "But mathematics is not everything. My men know this land. We have fortified positions, and we have something your hired guns do not." "What is that?" "Something worth dying for." Silence fell over the snowfield. The wind whispered through the pines. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath rising in white plumes against the blue sky. Then Clara stepped fully onto the porch. She stood tall despite her pregnancy, rifle steady in her hands. Her face showed no fear, only the cold, burning contempt of a woman who had been sold and traded and hunted and had decided finally and irrevocably that she was done. "Frederick." Her voice carried clearly in the cold air, every syllable precise. "I am not going back with you. Not now, not ever. You can threaten and bribe and send all the hired killers you want. The answer will always be the same." Blackwood's mask of civility cracked. For the first time, something real showed through, something ugly and desperate and violent. "You ungrateful little wretch! Do you have any idea what I paid for you, what your worthless aunt owes me?" "I know exactly what you paid," Clara said. $43, the price of a woman's life according to Margaret Hale. "And I know what happened to Eleanor. I know what you did to her. I know because she wrote it all down. Every bruise, every locked door, every night you came to her smelling of whiskey and rage." The words hit like bullets. Even from 50 yards Garrett could see the effect. Blackwood's face went white, then red, then a shade of purple that spoke of rage so intense it bordered on madness. "You will regret those words," Blackwood said, his voice no longer smooth, no longer cultured, the voice of the thing that lived beneath the expensive clothes and the Philadelphia manners. "You will regret them for the rest of your very short life." He turned to his men. "Tonight, after dark, burn it to the ground, kill the men, bring the woman to me alive." He paused, then added with a viciousness that turned Garrett's stomach, "If the baby survives the fire, that is acceptable. If not, I will simply have to put another one in her." Clara's face went white. Garrett raised his rifle. I would not stay too long if I were you, Blackwood. You are almost within range, and I am a very good shot." Blackwood laughed, but he was already turning his horse. "Tonight, Mr. Holden, enjoy your last hours." The column retreated, vanishing over the ridge, leaving only hoof prints in the snow and the lingering poison of Blackwood's words to mark their passage. Clara was trembling when Garrett reached her. He pulled her close, felt her heart pounding against his chest, felt the baby kick against his stomach as if the child inside her could sense the danger that surrounded its mother. "He means it," she whispered. "He will burn everything." "Let him try," Garrett said. "We will be ready." But ready was a relative term. 12 men against 3, plus a pregnant woman and whatever allies might come from Silver Creek if they got word in time. The odds were not good. The odds were, if Garrett was being honest with himself, terrible. But terrible odds were the only kind he had ever known, and he had survived them all. The blizzard came at dusk, as if the mountains themselves had decided to take sides. It swept down from the high peaks without warning, a wall of white that swallowed the world in minutes. Wind screamed around the cabin, driving snow horizontally through the air, reducing visibility to nothing. "Perfect," Wyatt said, checking the loads in his rifle. "They will not be able to see their hands in front of their faces." "Neither will we," Sawyer pointed out. "We do not need to see," Garrett said. "We know this land, every rock, every tree, every fold in the ground. They are strangers here. The mountain is on our side." Clara sat by the fire, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She had finally agreed to stay inside during the initial assault, but only after making Garrett promise that she could join the fight if things went badly. "They will come soon," she said. "He is not patient enough to wait out the storm." She was right. But before the attack came, something happened that none of them expected. Wyatt went out to check the perimeter one last time. He kissed Clara on the forehead before he left. A brotherly gesture, a promise of protection. He took his rifle and disappeared into the swirling white. He did not come back. Garrett waited 30 minutes, then an hour. Then he pulled on his coat and went to the barn where Wyatt's horse stood saddled and ready, riderless. And across the saddle, held in place by a hunting knife driven through the leather, was a note. "I have your brother. Bring the girl and the journal to the abandoned mine before dawn. Come alone. If you do not, I will send you pieces of him." Garrett read the words, read them again. And for the first time since Clara had come into his life, he felt the cold paralysis of pure fear. Not fear for himself, fear for Wyatt, for the brother he had protected and sheltered, and he now realized underestimated for 34 years. His hands shook as he carried the note back to the cabin. His voice broke when he read it aloud. "He has Wyatt," Garrett said, and the words tasted like ashes. Sawyer's face went rigid. "It is a trap. He wants to split us up, draw you out into the open, leave Clara undefended." "I know it is a trap," Garrett said, "but it is Wyatt, which is exactly why Blackwood chose him." They stood in the main room, fire crackling, wind howling, the clock on the mantel ticking away the hours they had left, and the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on them like the snow pressing against the windows. Go to the mine and walk into an ambush. Stay at the cabin and condemn Wyatt to whatever Blackwood had planned. It was Clara who broke the silence. "Neither," she said. Both men turned to look at her. "Neither option is acceptable, so we changed the options." She stood up from her chair. Her eyes were clear, her voice steady. The voice of a woman who had spent months learning from 3 men how to think tactically, how to assess a situation, how to find the third path when only 2 were offered. "Blackwood wants me and the journal. I go to the mine, alone, while Garrett and Sawyer approach from the sides, the same way you fought off the Pinkertons, the same way you have defended this land for 10 years. "Absolutely not," Garrett said. "Listen to me." Clara crossed to him, took his face in her hands, forced him to look at her. "Blackwood will not kill me, not yet. He needs the journal first. As long as he thinks I have it, I am safe. and as long as I am in front of him, his attention is on me, not on the darkness behind him, not on the two men with rifles who know this mountain better than their own names." Garrett stared at her, at this woman who had arrived in his life half dead and trembling, and had become over the course of one extraordinary winter the strongest person he had ever known. "The journal is not with me," Clara continued. "I hid it days ago. Sawyer knows where. If anything happens to me, it goes to Judge Morrison in Denver. Blackwood knows this. I made sure of it, which means he cannot risk hurting me until he has the journal in his hands, and he will never have it in his hands. Clara, the baby. The baby is exactly why I have to do this, because if Wyatt dies tonight, this family is broken, and I will not raise our child in a broken family. I will not let Blackwood take one more person from the people I love." She kissed him, hard and fierce and final. "Trust me," she said. "Trust what you taught me." Garrett closed his eyes. He thought of Sarah, of Lily, of the graves he had dug in frozen ground, of the 7 years he had spent building walls against exactly this kind of pain. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Clara, at the woman who had walked through every wall he had ever built. "Come back to me," he said. "I will. I promise." She disappeared into the storm 20 minutes later, alone, moving through the snow with a determination that the blizzard itself could not match. She carried no weapon that could be seen, but in her boot, pressed against her calf, was the small derringer that Sawyer had given her weeks ago with the instruction that it was only accurate at 10 feet. 10 feet would be enough, if she was close enough. The abandoned mine was 2 miles from the cabin, a relic from the silver rush of the previous decade. Timber-framed tunnels bored into the mountainside, dark, cold, the kind of place where the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Clara arrived first. She called out into the darkness, her voice swallowed by wind and stone. "I am here. Let him go." Blackwood's voice came from inside the mine, echoing off the walls. "Come in, slowly." She entered. The mine was lit by a single lantern. In its yellow light she saw Wyatt, tied to a support beam, his face bruised and swollen, one eye closed, blood crusted in his dark hair. But his other eye, the one that could still open, found hers in the dimness, and in it she saw not fear, but trust. He trusted her, trusted whatever plan had brought her here alone in the middle of a blizzard. Blackwood stood 10 feet away. He had removed his expensive coat. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. His hands were clean. He had not done the beating himself. That was what hired men were for. "The journal," he said. "Where is it?" "Safe. And it stays safe as long as everyone in this mine walks out alive." "That is not how this works." "That is exactly how this works, Frederick. You are not in Philadelphia anymore. You are on a mountain in Colorado in the middle of a blizzard. Your hired men are outside freezing in a storm they do not know how to survive. And the journal that can put you in prison for the rest of your life is in a location known only to one other person. A person who will send it to Judge Morrison by morning post if I do not return." Blackwood's composure cracked another inch. "You are bluffing. Try me." They stared at each other across the lamplight. The woman who had been sold for $43, and the man who had paid it. The prey who had become the hunter. The silence between them was electric, charged with months of running and fighting, and refusing to break. Then the night exploded. Garrett hit the mine entrance like a force of nature. He came out of the storm with his rifle blazing snow swirling around him like a white cloak, his ice-blue eyes locked on the men Blackwood had posted as guards. 2 shots, 2 men down, clean and precise and utterly without mercy. Sawyer came from the other side. His shotgun roared in the enclosed space of the mine tunnel, the sound amplified until it shook loose dirt from the ceiling. A third guard stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, and Sawyer was past him before the man hit the ground. Outside, the rest of Blackwood's hired guns scrambled to respond. But the blizzard was their enemy now. They could not see, could not coordinate, could not tell friend from foe in the whiteout conditions. They fired at muzzle flashes and hit snow. They shouted orders that the wind ripped apart and scattered. Garrett and Sawyer had spent 10 years on this mountain. They knew every rock formation, every tree, every angle of approach. In the darkness and the storm, they were ghosts, firing from positions the hired guns could not locate, moving before return fire could find them, using the mountain itself as a weapon. Inside the mine, Blackwood heard the shooting and understood that his carefully laid plan was collapsing. The composure that had carried him across 2,000 miles finally shattered. He lunged, not toward the exit, toward Clara. "If I cannot have you," he snarled, and there was nothing left of the Philadelphia gentleman now, nothing left of the cultured voice and the expensive clothes, only the raw and desperate violence that had killed 2 women before. "Then no one will." Clara's hand went to her boot. The Derringer was small, almost a toy. Sawyer had told her it was only accurate at close range. Blackwood was 8 feet away, then 6, then 4. She pulled the trigger. The sound was small compared to the rifles outside. A sharp crack, almost polite, swallowed immediately by the howl of the storm. But the bullet found its mark. Blackwood's right shoulder snapped backward. His charge became a stumble. His snarl became a scream. He hit the dirt floor of the mine and rolled, clutching the wound, blood seeping between his fingers. "Clara, behind you," Wyatt's voice hoarse and broken, cutting through the chaos. One of Blackwood's men had circled around through the back tunnel. He came at her from the darkness, hands reaching for her rifle, for her arms, for whatever he could grab. She did not have time to reload, did not have time to run. She turned and braced herself for the impact. It never came. Garrett materialized from the mine entrance like something conjured from the storm itself. He hit the man full force, driving him backward into the tunnel wall with the momentum of a man who had crossed 2 miles of blizzard on a wounded body powered by nothing but the absolute refusal to let another person he loved die while he was too far away to stop it. The hired gun went down. He did not get up. Garrett cut Wyatt free with 3 savage strokes of his knife. His brother sagged against the support beam, then straightened, found his feet, looked at Garrett with his one good eye. "Took you long enough," Wyatt said, and despite everything, despite the blood and the pain and the chaos still raging outside, he almost smiled. Garrett turned to Blackwood. The man lay on the mine floor, his expensive shirt soaked with blood from his shoulder wound, his face twisted with pain and rage and the dawning comprehension that he had lost, that all his money and all his connections and all his hired killers had not been enough to overcome 3 men on a mountain and a woman who refused to break. "She is my wife," Garrett said. He stood over Blackwood, and his voice was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. The voice of a man who had dug graves in frozen ground and survived 7 years of winter in his own heart, and had finally found something warm enough to thaw it. "The child she carries is my child. And if you ever come near them again, if you ever send anyone near them again, if your name so much as appears on a letter addressed to this territory, I will find you, and I will not use my fists." Outside, the shooting had stopped. The hired guns who could run had run. Those who could not lay in the snow, wounded and freezing, waiting for the mercy of strangers who had every reason to show them none. Sheriff Walker arrived at dawn. Someone in Silver Creek had seen the column of riders heading toward Thunder Ridge and had sent word. Walker and 8 men had fought through the blizzard all night to reach them. They found Frederick Blackwood sitting against the mine wall, hands bound with rope. His expensive clothes ruined his face, holding the expression of a man who had finally encountered a problem his money could not solve. "Get him out of my sight," Garrett said. Walker obliged, but the night was not finished with them. They had barely reached the cabin, barely gotten inside, barely begun to tend Wyatt's wounds and assess the damage when Clara stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, one hand braced against the table, the other pressed to her belly. "Garrett," she said, and her voice was different now, stripped of the iron will that had carried her through the confrontation with Blackwood, stripped of everything except raw primal urgency. "The baby is coming. Too early. 2 months too early. Stress and fear and violence and a 2-mile walk through a blizzard had triggered what could not be stopped." "We need a doctor," Wyatt said. He was standing now despite his injury, swaying slightly, his battered face tight with concern. "Doctor is in town," Sawyer replied, "and the storm is still raging." Garrett looked at Clara, at the pain etched on her face, at the way her hands gripped the table as another contraction tore through her, and he felt fear of a kind he had not experienced since the day he came home to find Sarah and Lily cold in their beds. "Then we do this ourselves," he said. They moved her to the bedroom, the same bed where Garrett had recovered from his own bullet wound weeks before. Wyatt built the fire until the room was almost unbearably warm, despite his beaten hands and his swollen eye. Sawyer brought water and clean cloths with the quiet efficiency that was his gift, anticipating every need before it was spoken. And Garrett knelt at the foot of the bed, his hands still bloodied from the fight, his face cut by flying debris, his body exhausted beyond anything he had ever endured, and he prepared to bring his child into the world. The labor was brutal. Clara screamed through contractions that came faster and harder, tearing through her body with the relentless intensity of the storm that still raged outside the walls. She gripped the bed frame until her knuckles went white. She bit through her lip, drawing blood. She cursed in words that would have scandalized Philadelphia society, and that Garrett loved her for because they were real and raw and unafraid. He examined her as gently as his shaking hands would allow, and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. "Breach," he said. The word came out steady. His voice did not betray the terror that had seized every cell of his body. "The baby is coming backwards." Just like Starlight's foal, the same impossible position, the same deadly mathematics. But this was not a horse. This was Clara. This was his wife. This was his child. "I need to turn the baby," he said. "It is going to hurt Clara, more than anything has ever hurt. But if I do not do it, I could lose you both." Clara looked at him through eyes glazed with pain. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead. Her skin was flushed and damp. She looked nothing like the half-frozen girl he had pulled from the snow months ago. She looked like a woman in the act of becoming a mother, the most powerful and the most vulnerable thing in the world. "Do it," she said. "Save our child." Garrett took a breath. He had done this before. He knew the movements, the careful manipulations required to rotate a breech baby. He had practiced on horses, on cattle, on the animals that had been his only family for 7 years before Clara arrived. But his hands had never shaken like this before. His heart had never hammered like this before. The stakes had never been anything close to this before. He reached inside her and began to work. Clara screamed, a sound that went through Garrett like a blade, a sound that would echo in his dreams for decades. But she did not pull away. She did not fight him. She trusted him, with her life, with their child's life, with everything she had and everything she was. Wyatt held her shoulders, not roughly, gently, the way he handled his paintbrushes, the way he handled everything that mattered. He murmured to her low and constant words that none of them would remember later, but that kept her anchored to the world when the pain threatened to sweep her away. Sawyer stood ready. Cloths and warm water and the steady presence of a man who had watched his own father die and had sworn that he would never stand helpless while someone he loved suffered. His green eyes were wet, but his hands were rock steady. The baby was stuck, tangled, unable to find the path. Garrett coaxed and guided, pushing here, pulling there. His eyes closed, every fiber of his being focused on the tiny body beneath his hands, remembering Starlight, remembering the foal that had come into the world in this same desperate way, remembering that he had saved them both. He could save them both again. He had to. "There," he breathed. "There it is, turning." The baby rotated under his hands, moving from impossible to merely difficult. He found a leg, grasped it with infinite care, began to pull, timing his efforts with Clara's contractions, working with her body instead of against it, partnering with the ancient mechanics of birth that had brought every human being into the world since the beginning of time. "Push," he said. "Clara, push now. Give me everything you have." She pushed, with the last of her strength, with the last of her will. With the fierce and absolute determination that had carried her out of Philadelphia and across 2,000 miles of wilderness and into the arms of a man who had forgotten how to live until she reminded him. The baby came into the world in a rush of blood and warmth and the raw miracle of new life. It was small, too small, red and wrinkled and covered in the evidence of its journey. And it was not moving. Garrett lifted the tiny body, cleared its mouth, rubbed it vigorously with clean cloth, his hands moving with the same urgent precision he had used on Starlight's foal, the same desperate prayer running through his mind. Come on, breathe, breathe for me. 1 second, 2, 3. The longest seconds of Garrett Holden's life, longer than the seconds he had spent digging graves in frozen ground, longer than the seconds between gunshots in the dark, longer than all the empty seconds of 7 empty years combined. The baby coughed, drew in a shuddering breath, and released a thin, wavering cry that filled the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. A boy. "We have a son," Garrett said, and his voice broke on the word, shattered completely like ice in the first thaw of spring, and what came flooding through the cracks was not grief, but joy, pure and overwhelming and almost too much for one human heart to contain. He placed the baby on Clara's chest, still connected by the cord that had nourished it through months of fear and flight and fighting. The child's cries softened as it felt its mother's heartbeat, the sound it had known for all the months of its existence, the sound of home. Clara was crying, tears streaming down her exhausted face mixing with sweat and blood and the holy mess of bringing a new life into the world. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, my little one. I have been waiting for you." Garrett knelt beside the bed, his hands trembling, his whole body shaking with relief and exhaustion and a love so fierce it felt like it might burn him alive. He looked at his wife, at his son, at the miracle they had created together in the middle of a blizzard on a mountain that had tried to kill them and had instead become their home. In the doorway Wyatt stood with his sketchbook, his battered face wet with tears, his one good eye taking in every detail of the scene before him, firelight on Clara's face, Garrett's rough hands cradling the newborn with impossible tenderness, the baby's tiny fist wrapped around his father's finger. He would paint this moment, the most important painting of his life, the painting that would hang in galleries in Denver and San Francisco and eventually New York, the painting that critics would call his masterpiece. But to Wyatt, it would always be something simpler. It would always be family. Sawyer leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his green eyes red and shining, and on his face the quiet smile of a man who had lost one family to tragedy and found another through choice. "Welcome to the world, little man," Sawyer said softly. "You have no idea what you have been born into. But I promise you this, it is going to be extraordinary." Dr. Wells arrived mid-morning the next day. He examined mother and child with the careful attention of a man who took his profession seriously. "They should not have survived," he said bluntly, standing in the kitchen with Garrett after the examination. "A breech birth, premature, no medical assistance. By all rights, she should be dead, the baby too." "But they are not dead," Garrett said. "No," the doctor shook his head in wonder. "Whatever you did it right. That boy is small but healthy, and your wife is stronger than any woman I have ever met." "I know. You should have lost them both, Holden." The doctor looked at him with something like respect. "Instead, you have a family. I would call that a miracle." "I would too." They named him Samuel. Samuel Garrett Holden. Samuel after Clara's father, the man who had loved her before the world stopped being kind. Garrett after the man who had taught her that the world could be kind again. "Lily's brother," Garrett said softly, reaching out to touch the baby's downy head where he slept in Clara's arms. "My daughter would have loved him." "She would have," Clara agreed, "and she does, wherever she is now." The weeks that followed brought resolution. Frederick Blackwood was transported to Denver in chains. The Journal of Eleanor Blackwood was delivered to Judge Morrison by Sawyer personally, who rode through 3 days of winter weather to ensure it arrived safely. The evidence was irrefutable. The testimony of a dead woman written in her own hand, describing years of cruelty and violence with the meticulous detail of someone who knew she might not survive to speak the words aloud. Blackwood was charged with murder, with kidnapping, with attempted murder, with a dozen other crimes that the territorial prosecutor pursued with the righteous energy of a man who had daughters of his own. His connections in Philadelphia meant nothing in Colorado. His money could not buy his way out of a frontier jail. Frederick Blackwood would die behind bars, and the world would be safer for it. Margaret Hale was released, but her fate was in many ways worse than prison. Word of her actions traveled east by telegraph and letter, spreading through the society she had valued above all else. The woman who had sold her niece for gambling debts found herself a pariah, shunned by the very circles she had spent a lifetime trying to impress. Bradford Hale, her own brother, published a statement in the Philadelphia Inquirer defending Clara's right to choose her own life. "Any woman brave enough to build a life in the territories," he wrote, "has more courage than the entirety of Philadelphia society combined." A letter arrived at Thunder Ridge 6 weeks after Samuel's birth, carried by the supply wagon from Silver Creek. It bore the seal of a Philadelphia law firm. Clara read it aloud while Garrett sat beside her, their son sleeping peacefully in the cradle Wyatt had built from pine wood, sanded smooth and carved with tiny horses along the rails. "Dear Mrs. Holden, it is my duty to inform you that Mr. Frederick Blackwood's assets have been frozen pending his trial. His family has disowned him. His reputation, such as it was, is destroyed beyond repair. Furthermore, Mrs. Margaret Hale has been publicly censured by the Crawford family. Her brother, Mr. Bradford Hale, has established a trust in your name, acknowledging the wrongs committed against you by his sister. You are free, Mrs. Holden, completely and legally free. No one will come for you again." Clara set down the letter, her hands trembling, but not with fear, with something far more powerful, with the overwhelming relief of a woman who had spent her entire adult life running and had finally been told she could stop. "It is over," she said, "truly over." Garrett pulled her close, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "It is just beginning," he said. "Our life, our family, everything we are going to build." He looked around the cabin, the same log walls, the same stone fireplace, the same windows looking out over the valley he loved. But everything was different now. There was a cradle by the fire, a woman's touch in every room, the smell of fresh bread and something floral that was uniquely Clara. There was Wyatt's painting on the wall, the portrait of Clara, by firelight, that had nearly caused a war between brothers and had become instead a symbol of how this family had learned to love without possessing. There was life here, love, hope, things Garrett had thought he would never have again. "Do you remember what I told you that first night?" Clara asked. "When you asked me where home was? You said you did not know, that you were still looking." She looked up at him, her storm-blue eyes filled with a contentment that matched his own. "I found it," she said. "Home is here, with you, with all of us." Garrett kissed her, soft and slow, a promise renewed. "Welcome home," he said. 5 years passed like water over mountain stone, smoothing the rough edges, deepening the channels, leaving the essential shape unchanged but somehow more beautiful for the wearing. Thunder Ridge grew. New rooms added as the family expanded. Samuel, at 5 years old, was already showing signs of the man he would become, tall for his age, strong and quiet like his father, with his mother's sharp intelligence and a gentleness that belonged entirely to himself. He kept watch over his twin sisters, Sarah and Lily, 3 years old now, named for the family they would never meet but whose memory lived on in every corner of the home their father had built. Wyatt found his own path. The portrait of Clara by firelight had traveled to a gallery in Denver, then to San Francisco, then to exhibitions that drew critics and collectors from across the country. He painted the West as no one had painted it before. Not the romanticized version of dime novels and Eastern imagination, but the real West. Harsh and beautiful and alive with the kind of truth that only comes from someone who has bled for it. He met Rose, the new school teacher, in Silver Creek on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was perfect and she was standing in exactly the spot where he needed to paint. He married her the following spring, and understood at last why Garrett had been unable to let Clara go. Because when you find the person who makes the world make sense, there is no choice. There is only recognition. Sawyer became the thing he was always meant to be. Not a rancher, though he could rope and ride with the best of them. Not a fighter, though he had proved his courage beyond any reasonable doubt. He became a voice. Silver Creek's first self-taught lawyer, using the education his Boston family had given him and the wisdom the frontier had taught him to defend the people who could not defend themselves. Homesteaders against land barons, miners against companies, women against the husbands who hurt them. He wrote to his mother in Boston for the first time in 12 years. She wrote back. The letter was short and stiff and imperfect, but it was a beginning, and Sawyer had learned that beginnings were enough. Clara taught school in Silver Creek 3 days a week, reading, writing, arithmetic. But more than that, she taught frontier children that their beginnings did not determine their endings, that a girl sold for $43 could become a wife, a mother, a teacher, a writer whose stories of frontier life had caught the attention of magazine editors in New York. That a woman who arrived on a mountain road half dead and freezing could become the heart of a family that stretched across the valley and into the town, and all the way to the places where her words were read by people who would never know her name but would carry her truth forward anyway. On a summer evening 5 years after Clara arrived at Thunder Ridge, Garrett sat with her on the expanded porch and watched the sun sink behind the mountains. The children played in the yard, Samuel chasing his sisters through the tall grass, their laughter carrying on the warm wind like music. 5 years, Clara said. Can you believe it? Sometimes it feels like yesterday, Garrett said. Sometimes it feels like 100 years. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, the comfortable posture of two people who had earned every moment of peace they possessed. Do you ever think about Sarah? She asked. Every day. What do you think she would say if she could see all this? Garrett was quiet for a long moment. He watched his son run through the grass, watched the twins tumble and shriek with joy, heard Wyatt and Rose laughing inside the house, heard Sawyer reading aloud from the porch swing, his Boston accent softened by years of mountain air. I think she would like you, Garrett said finally. She had a way of seeing through people, knowing who they really were beneath everything else. She would have seen your strength, your heart. She would have approved. And Lily, Garrett smiled. The expression that had been so rare 7 years ago and had become so natural now. Lily would have loved having sisters. She was always asking for a baby brother or sister. She would have been the most wonderful big sister in the world. Clara squeezed his hand. Then we honor them, every day, by living fully, by loving completely, by raising children who will carry their memory forward. The sun touched the peaks, painting the sky in gold and crimson and the deepest purple. The mountains stood sentinel around them, the same peaks that had witnessed their meeting, their struggles, their triumphs. A letter had arrived that morning, from Philadelphia, different handwriting than any they had received before. Clara had read it, set it aside, waited for evening to discuss it. The Blackwood family wants Eleanor's journal returned, she said. They are offering a great deal of money. Garrett looked at her. And what do you think? Clara watched the children playing, watched the mountains catching fire in the sunset, watched the life she had built from nothing but courage and the willingness to trust. I think Eleanor deserves to be heard, she said. That journal belongs exactly where it is, in the court records, where the truth lives. Garrett nodded. That is my answer, too. They sat together as the light faded, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, as the sounds of their children drifted through the open windows and the mountains settled into the deep peace of a summer night. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds. Two wounded souls who had healed together. two halves of a whole that neither had known they were missing. And this is the part of the story where I ask you something. When was the last time you stood your ground when everything in the world was telling you to run? When was the last time you chose the harder path because you knew it was the right one? When was the last time you let someone in? Truly, in past all the walls you have spent a lifetime building. Because here is the truth that Garrett Holden learned on a frozen mountain in Colorado, and that Clara Bennett learned on a stagecoach heading west, and that Wyatt learned with a paintbrush in his hand, and that Sawyer learned in a cabin full of people who chose him when his own family did not. Love is not a weakness. It is not a risk to be managed or a vulnerability to be defended against. Love is the thing that turns three men hiding from life into a family. Love is the thing that turns a girl running from monsters into a woman who faces them down. Love is the thing that survives blizzards and gunfights and breech births and the long, ordinary years that follow, which are in many ways harder than any battle because they require the daily choice to stay, to show up, to be present for the people who need you. And it is never too late. That is the part that matters most. It is never too late to choose love over fear, to open the door when someone knocks in the storm, to say yes when everything in your experience tells you to say no. Garrett Holden was 37 years old and 7 years dead inside when Clara Bennett stumbled onto his mountain road. He thought his life was over. He was wrong. The best part was just beginning. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to hit that like button. It helps more than you might think. And if you know someone out there carrying something heavy in silence, share this with them. Sometimes a story is the nudge a person needs. I would like to know. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment. I read every one. Because sometimes being ruined is just another word for being set free. And sometimes a wrong turn on a mountain road leads exactly where you were always meant to go. Some things are worth fighting for. Some things are worth bleeding for. And love the real kind, the kind that survives everything the world can throw at it and still gets up in the morning and makes coffee and watches the sunrise, is always worth both. Garrett Holden knew that. Clara Bennett Holden knew that. And now perhaps you know it too.